Okay, I think we are live.
Okay.
The meeting is being live streamed. I'll just confirm.
Mhm.
Perfect. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. I am Ishan Sharma, and we are here for another Karwan special lecture titled The NFDC New Indian Cinema and the Contemporary Discourses on Good Cinema, 1960s to 1990s. But before going into the conversation and introducing today's speaker, I would like to take a moment to remember uh, a scholar whom we lost this afternoon, um, Professor V.D. Chattopadhyay, who remains one of the greatest and the tallest scholars of our times. And we used when we were in our first year in college. I think that was a time when we got introduced to BD Chattopadhyay, and we used to say, yeah, BDC to padna is most important, whether you read anything or not. You have to read BDC, and he was known as BDC amongst students who was his direct students or anyone of any generation. And I think his books will remain guiding lights for many generations of history students. His books like The Concept of Bharatvarsha or The Early Medieval India and others. So we are deeply saddened to learn about his demise, and I hope um he'll uh, he'll rest in peace, and he'll keep guiding us so wherever he is. So thank you so much, Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay, for all your path-breaking work that you did. Now, coming back to the session, today's session I think is the most interesting for me, for my this newborn interest in cinema, जो बीच बीच में volcano की तरह erupt होके आता है. So we are going to talk about NFDC. So this presentation is divided into three parts. The first part gives the history of the desire for a new cinema in India and goes on to explore the roles of the NFDC or FFC in facilitating the arrival of such a cinema. The second part deals with the curiosities around what constitutes a good cinema. From the government circles to film lovers, critics, and common readers of film magazines. So, what do they think of? What do they perceive of good cinema? The third part of this conversation, of this lecture, deals exclusively with what the master, like Satyajit Ray, himself thought of the Indian New Wave and his contemporaries. This presentation, this conversation will help the listeners understand a very important aspect in history of in the cultural history of the important chapter of the cultural history of in newly independent India, post-independent India, and the new cinema movement that happened. This presentation investigates questions like to what extent and why the government was invested in facilitating a good cinema movement in India, and how did this desire for a good Indian cinema force the government to finance such a film. I think that remains a big question. Um, and with help of a discourse analysis, this talk addresses the issue of India's struggle to reach a consensus on what constitutes a good cinema, often ending in dead ends. And was this struggle to come to a common agreement on good cinema symptomatic to something else? And why would Satyajit Ray, the master himself, keep a distance from many of his contemporaries, who were making good cinema? Now, the speaker, after this long introduction, I am happy to introduce Dr. Sudha Tiwari, who teaches at the School of Liberal Arts, UPES, Dehradun. She has a PhD from Center for Historical Studies, JNU, and Sudha wrote her PhD thesis on the NFDC and the new Indian cinema movement. She is interested in history of contemporary India, Indian or the mainstream Hindi cinema, and and especially the institutional history and critical cultural policy studies. She has recently signed a contract with the Routledge India team to finish the monograph based on her first doctoral work. So thank you so much, Sudha, for accepting the invitation. And without further ado, I think I've taken a lot of time. Now over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishan. A very good evening to you and to your listeners. We will directly go to the presentation. So as Ishan has also told the audience, the viewers, the presentation is divided into three parts, all right? So I think I'll just start sharing my screen. Mostly I'll be reading from my paper, but there are a few visuals and few pointers also on the PowerPoint. So just give me a second. All right. So let's start. The newly independent India had accorded high importance to nation building through institutions. Most of us will, most of us remember India's first Prime Minister, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, as for being an institutional builder, among various other things that he's remembered for. Various institutions that he and India built during post-independent times, immediately after the independence in 1947, included various educational and cultural institutions. These institutions were guided by democratic socialism and the notion of a welfare state, with an objective to form citizens for the modern state. According to Mulk Raj Anand, and I quote him, national independence was to mean not merely political freedom, but the evolution of a civilization in which the individual human being would have his self-respect restored to him and his self-confidence encouraged, which would give him faith in the best thing of India's past against the imperialist contempt and for creative living in the present, unquote. The first Indian Institute of Technology was set up in 1951 at Kharagpur, followed by Bombay, Madras, and Delhi, which was set up in 1961. Apart from building IITs, various cultural bodies were founded to promote film, literature, drama, music, art, and painting. As early as 1948, the government of India created the films division, and I'm quoting, to lead the production and distribution of Indian information films, unquote, adapting them, quote, to the new times of peace and independence for Nehru's larger project of nation building, integration, and development, unquote. Three important academies were established in early 1950s. Sangeet Natak Academy, which came in 1952, dealt with performing arts. Sahitya Academy was established in 1954 and it dealt with literature, followed by Lalit Kala Academy, which was established in 1954, dealing with fine arts. Sangeet Natak Academy also set up the National School of Drama as one of its constituent units in 1959. The Indian Council of Cultural Relations, ICCR, was formed in 1950 by Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, followed by the establishment of National Book Trust in 1957, which also played an instrumental role in nation building. National Book Trust published books in various Indian languages at low cost. ICCR proved influential in connecting India with the scholarship and arts of India's neighbors. Cultural scholarships were offered to students of Asian and African countries to encourage contacts between students of those countries and India. Similarly, the establishment of several science laboratories in different parts of India provided incentives for pure and applied research. The Atomic Energy Commission, which was formed in 1948, dedicated itself to the task of atomic energy for peacetime construction, refusing to make experiments in atomic bombs, unquote. In all these efforts to institutionalize culture and knowledge, cinema somewhere lagged behind. While the creation of Films Division as early as 1948 had proved that the Indian government was aware of the importance of films in growth, in development, and as a propaganda machinery as well, it was still contemptuous towards the wider Indian film industry. The industry, privately owned and operated, did not receive much attention from the Indian state for quite late. The only two ways the Indian state dealt with it was through censorship and entertainment tax. One needs to locate, place, contextualize the formation and contribution of the two corporations, which is Film Finance Corporation and National Film Development Corporation. The short forms would be FFC and NFDC. We need to situate the the formation and contribution of these two corporations in the background of this apathy from the government of India, at the same time taking interest into so-called other elite cultural aspects like music, dance, drama, etc. But again, when it came to feature films, government of India did show some sort of hesitation and apathy in the beginning. However, after much maneuvering, just to cut short the long story, film society movement had already established itself quite firmly from late 1940s onwards. Much before India got independence, Satyajit Ray, along with his few friends like Mary Sutton, etc., were very much active into film society movement. There was already a desire which existed to make a different kind of cinema, which was very different from what film studios in Bombay and Madras were making. Many of these young filmmakers, one of them was Satyajit Ray, were very keen followers of Italian neorealism and other European new wave or impressionism, etc. And they wanted to bring those ideas, those artistic impressions of filmmaking to Indian film screen as well. And they also had this kind of a greed that why Indian films are not duly represented when it comes to film festivals abroad or international film awards. And one of the answers that the likes of Satyajit Ray came to find was that we lack somewhere in not only in technological advancements, but our story, the way we tell our stories on the screen also needs to be changed. For that, they knew that private capital will not let them make that kind of cinema. So their struggle in the late 1940s and early 1950s was two-way. One is to create a space through film society movement to have a discussion on the artistic aspect of cinema, to look at cinema not just as an industry, but also as an aesthetic practice, as an art. Secondly, the second point of struggle for them was to how to convince the newly formed government, the newly independent government of India, to come to their rescue, either through finances or or maybe giving a bit of leeway as far as censorship rules is concerned. But mostly, I think the major concern for these young filmmakers who wanted to make quote unquote different cinema was that of finance. This is where after about 10 to 12 years of struggle, maneuvering, an active movement as far as film society and film clubs is concerned, starting from Calcutta, etc. That's where we have to figure out the importance of Film Finance Corporation. But again, if you read Film Inquiry Commission's report, which came in 1950-51, that had recommended the formation of a Film Finance Corporation, but it took about 10 more years of maneuvering and discussions and conversations and pressure, etc., on the government of India to actually finally form Film Finance Corporation in 1960. So let me go back to my paper and let's just see how exactly Film Finance Corporation helped some of these filmmakers. After much maneuvering and long wait, the FFC was finally set up in 1960. The first decade of its functioning was dominated by its active financial support to already established filmmakers, likes of Satyajit Ray. It was only the late 1960s that changed how one looked at the FFC and what one meant by new Indian cinema. B.K. Karanjia's chairmanship had played a very important role in the late 1960s to finally how FFC and New Indian cinema finally tasted legitimacy. With the 5 films that came to be released in late 1960s and early couple of years of early 1970s, for example, Bhuvan Shom, Sara Akash, Uski Roti, Maya Darpan, and 27 Down. When these 5 films were released between 1969 and 1974, it seemed that the new cinema had finally arrived in India, and FFC had gained legitimacy as an official benefactor of the movement. Henceforth, any film financed by the FFC was clubbed under the new cinema rubric. Critics were very happy about Hindi motion picture heading for a new era. Bhuvan Show was seen as the antithesis of all that is meretricious, escapist, formula-ridden, and unrealistic in Hindi films, unquote. The then Information and Broadcasting Minister I.K. Gujral was reported to have said in the Lok Sabha that films produced with assistance from the FFC had, and I quote him, succeeded in introducing a new wave in Indian films, unquote. He praised the role of FFC in encouraging young and dynamic filmmakers, and I'm quoting him again, in spite of the serious financial constraint, the corporation has lived up to the country's expectation as a trend setter. Year after year, and this year again, the work of young directors committed to wielding the tool of cinema for true creative expression, fearless probe of the contemporary reality, and exploration of new creative avenues, who found in the FFC a sympathetic sponsor, have won recognition, unquote. There was a euphoria created on the success of these films. B.K. Karanjia, who was the chairperson of the corporation, referred to Bhuvan Shom as that, and I'm quoting him, first faint glimmer of this new appreciation in the Hindi cinema, unquote. Mrinal Sen himself pointed out to a certain inclination among a very small section of the film traders ready to encourage productions of, as they said, and I'm quoting, the Pather Panchali type, unquote, filmmaking. Films started being made by non-marketable people. He affirmed, Mrinal Sen affirmed, and I'm quoting him, it seems we have arrived. It seems with zeal almost missionary in its intensity, we are fast heading towards a new cinema with capital N and capital C, towards a new look, something fresh, unconventional, dissenting, iconoclastic, unquote. He also emphasized on mobilizing the minority spectators scattered all over the country for the benefit of low-budget films. Only they, the minority spectators, could help low-budget films get readily accepted as a sound commercial proposition, unquote. Sen further said, and I'm quoting him, when we say we have to make low-budget films, we act against the establishment, disproving one of their vital tenets, that filmmaking is an expensive proposition and therefore nobody else's business, unquote. Because of the success of some of these early films, like the ones which I just mentioned, something big was also happening among the banking industry. So far, we know that because film industry was a very risky business, that was the impression, like that any film can flop in spite of having song, dance, drama, or stars. Banking industry, etc., could never dare to give finances to producers or to especially young filmmakers who would try to make films without any song or in black and white maybe, or without any star cast as such. But because of the success of some of these 5-6 films which I just cited in front of you, banks were reassured by the success of these films and they agreed to be part of a co-financing arrangement with the corporation. Again, here was a catch that the FFC had to come as a guarantor before the banks could sanction some of these minor loans to these young producers or young filmmakers trying to make a different kind of cinema. But this was again a very, very important intrusion into the banking industry that, thanks to these 5-6 films and thanks to the corporation and some of its early successes, banking industry could be could be convinced that they can try to support some of these young filmmakers. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting had given green signal to the FFC and Dena Bank to implement the plan for granting loans to film producers. As per this scheme, the Dena Bank agreed to finance loans on a 50-50 basis to the maker of a feature film duly guaranteed by the FFC. The United Commercial Bank of Calcutta, one of the nationalized banks in the country, agreed to finance Mrinal Sen's next film titled Chorus. Sen rightly pointed out that if the nationalized banks came into this field in a big way, the financing of films through dubious sources would end and may lead to the cessation of the evil of black money in films. So far, till about 1970s, mid 1970s, the Film Finance Corporation was actually working like a bank. Its main purpose was to finance different ideas, young filmmakers who wanted to make quote unquote different kind of films. What Mrinal Sen and Arun called new cinema with capital N and capital C in their new cinema manifesto that they wrote in 1968. FFC did succeed in creating a base for a healthy film revolution. It succeeded in introducing a new wave in Indian films. Even a private advertising agency called Blaze Enterprise was encouraged to finance and support Shyam Benegal's first 3 films, including Ankur. The rise of Indian middle class, as represented by Rishikesh Mukherjee, Gulzar, and others in the mid-1970s, was a direct result of changes brought by the new wave in film language and audience taste. Undoubtedly, the FFC and Indian new cinema movement tasted legitimacy. However, the euphoria got over very soon when the details of unpaid and bad debt started coming out. The discourse of commercialism, corporations' inability to repay loans and make profits was to lead to a suggestion of merging FFC with Indian Motion Picture Export Corporation, in short, IMPEC, and to create another film corporation. So I think immediately after Uski Roti and Maya Darpan, when the experimenters came on the scene, and also people started reading the annual reports and how FFC was unable to repay the loans that it was taking from the government of India. Quite a bit of unease prevailed, and people started already questioning the authenticity, the need, the necessity of Film Finance Corporation. Some of these I will discuss in the second part when I'm discussing the discourses on good cinema. How exactly NFDC comes to be in the picture? So this is exactly the kind of discourses which started coming up by 1973-74, questioning the legitimacy of organization like corporation, FFC, and the whole question on why these young filmmakers are getting money out of the taxpayers' pocket, etc. Their films don't run in the cinema theater. Why should why should the taxpayers' money be wasted on these films? This is exactly the kind of situation when the whole conversation on NFDC started coming up, which was finally set up in 1975 with the broad objective to plan, promote, and organize an integrated and efficient development of Indian film industry in accordance with the national economic policy. Now, this was sort of the burden, the pressure that the government was facing, which was again put up on the corporation and on new cinema. The NFDC was also supposed to follow the objectives laid down by the government. So whatever autonomy they had so far, that was kind of started to be withdrawn slowly and gradually by the government. Interestingly, the NFDC did not function from 1975 to 1980. One of the many casualties of the emergency, which was imposed in 1975, lifted in 1977. Then Janata Party's government came up, which was again quite an unstable government. So we see that from 75 to 79, 80, nothing much is happening as far as NFDC is concerned. Nothing much is happening as far as Film Finance Corporation is concerned. So NFDC was again revived only in 1980, and IMPEC as well as FFC was finally merged with NFDC to become one unit. That also meant that NFDC will have a lot of responsibility to shoulder on itself. From 1975, the tone of the Indian state was also changing. It was changing its gear from being a socialist welfare state to a liberal economy. The imposition of the emergency played a key role in this transition, politically and culturally too. It severely affected the new cinema movement and FFC as well. Yes. It was an all-pervading truth that quality films need more support in distribution and exhibition than production and financing. So far we see that till mid 1970s or till 1980 itself, FFC was more concerned about financing these filmmakers, or like, you know, helping them with finances or production, etc., to make these films that they wanted to make. But one major thing, like, you know, that was either missing, either intentionally or unintentionally, or maybe, I mean, as many people like, you know, have talked about it, that the private agencies had such a strong hold on the distribution and exhibition sector of Indian film industry that even the government could not intrude that space. Plus, the kind of filmmakers, like, you know, we're talking about, they lack that business acumen, that they will not only make the film, but they will also go to the market and try to, like, you know, sell their own product. So I mean, in fact, in one of the annual reports of Film Finance Corporation, it actually sympathizes with the new cinema filmmakers, saying that they lack business acumen, and maybe it is our responsibility to provide them with distribution and exhibition spaces. But for some reason, like, you know, in spite of all the efforts, the whole concept of Janta theaters, trying to, like, you know, buy a couple of theaters in Bombay and in Delhi, like, and I think also the whole thing of the political instability that started from 1975 onwards, and the first wave of liberal economic reforms that came in 1979 during the Janta government, that had kind of, like, you know, put the whole government's plan of creating new cinema theaters like, you know, back. It was put into a back burner because somehow it was not realized to be an incentive, and the nation had different kind of challenges, etc. So new theaters were not coming up. The old theaters, which were somewhat, like, you know, reserved for releasing some of these films, were also, like, gone out of the hands of FFC. This is exactly like, you know, where NFDC comes in. The desire to release more quality films, which were also, like, you know, by now they were called as parallel cinema, thanks to the arrival of Shyam Benegal and his kind of films, Ankur, Nishant, and Manthan, etc. Required construction of more cinema houses, which in turn required structural policy level changes. It needed a better coordination between FFC and state agencies. FFC needed to be strengthened, which was not possible with its meager authorized capital. So it was decided to revive and strengthen NFDC by merging FFC and Impact with it. So one of the reasons why the idea of NFDC was coined was so that it can generate its own income, its own money, can get more, like, you know, resources on its own without being dependent on the government, so that it can also focus on distribution and exhibition of its own films that it was either financing or producing. The government had decided to activate NFDC and merge FFC and Impact with it. It was finally activated in May 1980. However, emphasis on NFDC's economic viability indicated forthcoming pressures on the corporation and new cinema. The private film industry was also not very keen to accept NFDC's suzerainty or work under its control. Though the definition of good cinema did not change, the burden of economic viability and control on fresh talent was to effectively change the nature and content of new cinema films. NFDC's 100% financing scheme was the best proposal that came out of these deliberations. So far we see that FFC was only engaged in financing. They were not 100% producing these films. So far, FFC would give about like 75% of the finance, and 25% finance, etc., was supposed to be, like, you know, created by the filmmaker or the producer concerned, applying for FFC loans, etc. They were supposed to generate their own 25-30% of amount on their own. But this whole thing of 100% financing, whereby NFDC will have total control on the copyrights of the film, etc. That was the first very important proposal that came out of the NFDC's new structuring. And we will see that, like, a different crop of filmmakers would come in the 1980s, making a different sort of cinema. Unlike FFC, NFDC was not only responsible for financing new cinema, it was also burdened during the 1980s with an overall development of the Indian film industry. The government had clearly expressed its favoritism towards Doordarshan, with film industry and NFDC being neglected in the seventh plan. So we also, as I just I was just talking about the first round of liberal economic reforms coming up. So the seventh planning, that came in 1985. This is, again, I'm talking about Rajiv Gandhi's prime ministership. Once again, film industry was treated not so well, and Doordarshan was emerging as the favorite pet project of Rajiv Gandhi's government. So most of the money would be diverted to the creation and construction and promotion of Doordarshan, etc. So film industry and, of course, NFDC, which used to work under Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and it got most of its funding from the government directly, was also affected, thereby burdening the NFDC for creating its own resources. But then again, was the picture all this gloomy, or how exactly was NFDC trying to negotiate with all these challenges, and what kind of films did it produce in the 1980s when it was revised, restructured, and FFC was merged with it? NFDC, among all this chaos, still managed to continue supporting the alternative cinema movement and filmmakers with fresh and aesthetically rich ideas, along with winning awards nationally and internationally. At Cannes Festival, New Indian cinema triumphed with a trio of 16 low-budget production. Govind Nihalani's Akrosh, Cry of the Wounded, which was the co-winner of Grand Prix at the 1981 Delhi Festival. It was shown in the film market also. Saeed Akhtar Mirza's Albert Pinto Ko Gussa Kyun Aata Hai and Rabindra Dharam Raj Chakra. All these three films won quite a few awards at the Cannes Film Festival in early 1980s. All these films were made in 16 unlike the earlier FFC films made in 35 16 supposedly could be made in a lower budget compared to 35 and this was something new which was happening in early 1980s under the leadership of NFDC. Film critics did notice that these astounding films of social criticism were government sponsored. Dorothy Holloway stressed that the prominence of the NFDC with a stand at the Cannes Festival enabled the grand entrance of new Indian cinema into the world film arena. After Cannes, the American audience was presented with the alternate cinema of India, which opened at the Museum of Modern Art. Once again. Just trying to go back. One second. Yes. Yeah. Dorothy Holloway stressed that the prominence of the NFDC with a stand at the Cannes Festival enabled the grand entrance of new Indian cinema into the world film arena. After Cannes, the American audience was presented with the alternate cinema of India, which opened at the Museum of Modern Art and was to take an extensive tour of the United States. A symposium on new Indian cinema and its roots was also held. William Greaves, a New York-based independent filmmaker, served as its moderator. Participants in the symposium included Smita Patil, Mridal Sen, Shyam Benegal, Girish Karnad, Kumar Shahani, and Govind Nihalani. It seemed a good start for the corporation and new Indian cinema post-amalgamation. For the first time, the corporation embarked on co-production of films it entered into a co-production arrangement with Indo-British Films Limited for the production of a film on Mahatma Gandhi, the film which Richard Attenborough made, titled Gandhi. NFDC was one of its co-producers, and it brought a lot of money to NFDC in the 1980s. The corporation's total investment in this prestigious project was expected to be around rupees 6.50 crores, but it was one of the most profitable ventures NFDC was part of. This investment was not only expected to be recouped fully, but also generate some profits for the corporation, which it finally did. In NFDC's first, okay, I'll skip this part and then I'll go to the next one. The directors of the Film Finance Corporation were happy to share that the FFC/NFDC produced films, once regarded as a taboo, had started selling before release, and some had been profitably marketed even while under production. They claimed, in the process, our products have not become commercial, but the culture sought to be perpetuated has started having its impact both on cinema goers and distributors. In NFDC's first script award competition, Pradeep Krishan had won the best script award for Messi Sahib, which was also made, and Raghuveer Yadav played the title role. Kundan Shah was one of the two third prize winners for this script called A Detective Story. Perhaps Jaane Bhi Do Yaro was based on this script that he had submitted to NFDC's script award competition. And NFDC also produced it with 100%, giving 100% finances to the film. DVS Raju, who was the then chairperson of NFDC, discussed the 100% production plan in an interview and told that the NFDC wanted to extend it to those gifted filmmakers who do not have the resources or business minds, unquote. The corporation was to own the world rights of these films that it was producing by giving 100% finances without interfering in the making. The films granted loans included the films which were granted loans under 100% financing. It included very important films that perhaps most of us may have seen. Govind Nilanin's Ardha Satya, Kamal Swaroop's Om Dar Badar, Saeed Mirza's Mohan Joshi Hazir Ho. NFDC's own production was Tarang, which was directed by Kumar Shahni. Now, Tarang came after about 12 years of break for Kumar Shahni. This kind of might I might refer to why there was this huge gap between Maya Darpan and Tarang when I discuss Satyajit Ray and his opinion on his contemporaries. Shanta Singh, one of the very important film critics, pointed out to the box office performance of Ardha Satya and Saransh, which was included also in the panorama. She wrote, and I'm quoting her, "The stage when it was convenient to label new cinema as something the audience did not want to look at and which the establishment chose to ignore is over. Today, even those borderline filmmakers who have long been out in the cold and who swore that the audience was an unnecessary adjunct to cinema are having to rethink their theoretical premise." Calling the NFDC supported films as cinema of soul, she praised NFDC for producing a film like Party. Immediately, and I'm quoting her, "Immediately after the end, a single credit line flashes on the screen. Producer, National Film Development Corporation. This is at once the most significant and hopeful sign of contemporary cinema. It proves that the takers for the cinema of soul are there in the establishment itself, just as it marks the presence of authors who have the courage, the clarity, the conviction to make films for their own sake, to communicate a particular truth, worldview, feeling, and conviction. This is the cinema of artists who, in these troubled times, have remained resolute in their intellectual stance, who have had the courage to follow a project, a film, through to the end. Itself speaks a relatively good year," unquote. Of the NFDC's own production, Deb Shishu and Messi Sahib was completed during 1985, and Mirch Masala was likely to be completed. During 1986-87, 15 films, including documentary. So NFDC was entering documentary filmmaking also in the mid-1980s. They were approved for granting of loans. Script committee had selected following scripts for production with NFDC films. Yatra by Gautam Ghosh, Parinda by Vidhu Vinod Chopra. So again, a first for NFDC. Parinda, as we know, is one of those famous late 1980s films showing Bombay and its mafia world, criminal world, etc. It's a very mainstream Bollywood film, which was financed by the NFDC, not produced, but financed by the NFDC. So again, a first for NFDC. And we also can see that this may have been a decision taken out of pragmatism, like, because they wanted to, it was unlike FFC, it was entirely like left by the government to generate its own income. So they had to take some of these decisions of like entering into the documentary filmmaking market, supporting documentary filmmakers, or supporting some of these like quote unquote mainstream conventional filmmaking, who may have better box office records, giving some earning, some profit to the corporation as well. Pest and G by Vijaya Mehta was also produced by the NFDC. Meera Nair had applied to NFDC for her very, very internationally very well known, nationally also very well known film Salam Bombay in March 1987. And she, in her diary entries, not only writes about her experiences of working with the corporation, which is sometimes it may have been a little annoying, but largely she had a good experience of approaching the NFDC top management for the loan, and how she receives the loan, and how Vijay Tendulkar was one of the members of the team that visited her set of Salam Bombay, where she was training these Bombay slum kids for acting, etc. And how, like after checking everything, Vijay Tendulkar, the very famous playwright, and also who has also worked with Govind Nilani, and how like the loan was sanctioned to her to make Salam Bombay. And we know Salam Bombay is one of those very important films that came in the late 1980s. At the completion of 10 years of its existence in 1990, the NFDC declared a period from 1980 to 1990 as a golden decade and a decade of excellence. To celebrate the occasion, the corporation hosted a dinner party for the film industry on 27th April 1990 in Bombay. In this decade, NFDC had completed 67 films, 32 of them by debutant directors, 57 were either released commercially or telecast on Doordarshan, and 18 films were under production. These films won 68 national and 69 international awards. The tagline below these achievements said, "These are not just figures, they are signs of a new force in the Indian cinema, and this is only the beginning," unquote. Various Hindi films that NFDC financed and produced during 1980 to 1990 include, and I just want to share some of these names with you. Akrosh, Albert Pinto ko gussa kyun aata hai, Jaane Bhi Do Yaro, Godam, Par, Party, Pep Shishu, Messi Sahib, Mirch Masala, Mahayatra, Pestanji, Ek Din Achanak, Om Dar Badar, Trishagni, Ek Ghar, Kamla Ki Maut, Salim Langde Pe Matro, Ek Doctor Ki Maut, and Kasba, that came in 1990. Kasba was also made by Kumar Shambi. I think I will stop here, the first part, and then I'm going to take you to a sort of a audio-visual break before I move on to the second part. So I'm going to stop my PowerPoint and will take you to the YouTube link. So this is an NFDC corporate video of like about 5 minutes. This will introduce you to various activities, the journey of NFDC, what kind of films it supported, and what exactly it does post 1990s. And maybe you can decide for your own self about the whole success, failure, and achievement on NFDC, where it was and where it is right now, and maybe make your own opinion.
My name is Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi.
Film restoration and film preservation is very, very important for a number of reasons. First of all, cinema and films become a record of our society, how we are in this day and age. I think that this is an extremely important process that we need to do. For our culture as rich as India, it is very important to have, our culture preserved through cinema.
I think it's wonderful if NFDC can, do this sincerely and with all the effort. I think it'll be fantastic. It'll be the best thing that they will do to restore films and to preserve it for future. It would be the best thing that will happen to Indian cinema.
शिक्षा का सूरज है निकला, हो रहा है अब उजाला, आंखें खोलो।
हमको भी है लिखना पढ़ना, हमको भी है आगे बढ़ना, तुम भी बोलो। शिक्षा का सूरज है निकला, हो रहा है अब उजाला, आंखें खोलो। हमको भी है लिखना पढ़ना, हमको भी है आगे बढ़ना, तुम भी बोलो।
Okay, I'm stopping the video here. So to summarize the first part, what exactly I was trying to narrate about Film Finance Corporation and the NFDC, I can give you a few pointers to remember before I move on to the second part of the talk. So one thing is very, very clear, that comes in my research and also with all the conversation that I have had with some of these very important filmmakers from Kumar Shani to Shyam Benegal to MS Sathyu, who made Garam Hawa. They said that they have openly confessed that they would not have made the films that they could make in the 1970s, 80s, or even early 90s without the ready, liberal, open-minded help that came from the Film Finance Corporation and then NFDC. So most of these directors have had good experiences with the corporation. And one thing is very true, that the kind of films that was made under the rubric of new cinema may not have been possible without the support that came from the two corporations, especially Film Finance Corporation, that set the tone to make some of these films. And today we see that in the form of indie films, independent cinema like Masan, etc., or Aankho Dekhi, the spirit is still very, very alive. Directors like Anurag Kashyap, Anand Gandhi, when he makes A Ship of Theseus, which I think was also co-produced, or maybe some sort of help did come from NFDC in that film as well. So the spirit is very much alive. NFDC may not be that active today in filmmaking, but it is again very, very active as in the role of a facilitator through its film bazaar that it organizes annually as part of the International Film Festival of India in the month of November and December. So today it like creates that platform whereby the independent filmmakers can avail the facilities at the film bazaar, sell their ideas, their pitch, come and meet international, global, or even national distribution and exhibition agencies to release their films, etc. So the story, of course, has a break in the 1990s because of the again the second very large major round of economic reforms which were announced and which directly affected PUCs, the public utility agencies, etc. And NFDC was one agency that was at loss. But even before flickering, if I can mention some of the films that it supported in early 1990s, that is after 91, 92. Films like Mammo, Naseem, Charadhyay, some of these films came from the storehouse of NFDC, and of course these were made by not young filmmakers but by already established filmmakers. So by that way, NFDC did have an assurity on the profit that these films will make, or that they will be sold in the national international market. But much before it flickered, for some period of time in the late 1980s, it did make important films like Mammo, Naseem, Charadhyay, Diksha, Aranyak, Rudali, Devi Ahilyabai, etc. So to again reiterate my point, and of course maybe I have not given the criticism of NFDC, but I did point out that how NFDC and before that FFC did fail majorly as far as releasing these films are concerned, or creating distribution and exhibition spaces for these films, which harmed the filmmakers in a massive major way. That will be discussed in the second part when I'm talking about discourses. But again, going back and repeating the point, and this is again I'm perhaps voicing some of these filmmakers who worked with the two corporations, that new cinema would not have been possible without the active support and ready support with a non-interference policy as far as content is concerned that came from the two corporations. Criticism, etc., definitely maybe that could be a discussion for another time. But let me take you to the second part, which is again very amusing to see, and will also perhaps make most of us go sympathetic to some of these filmmakers, new cinema filmmakers, the kind of attack they faced in the 1970s and 80s. Yeah, just a second. So the second part deals with the curiosity around what constitutes a good cinema, and engages with a lot of discourses that were created among the government circles, to the film lovers, critiques, and common readers of film magazines also. How people were reacting to not just the new cinema, but also to the whole role played by the two corporations, the FFC and then the NFDC. The questions that one wonders, that comes to one's mind is that, did India agree on what makes a good cinema? What constitutes a good film? And how did it react to the new Indian cinema, which was purportedly a step in the direction of achieving good cinema? The answer is very complicated and at times can become very abusive and verbally violent. The kind of things that were written back and forth in film magazines, film journals, etc. It seems to be quite a masculine space. When I read some part of this, you will understand what I'm trying to say. The new Indian cinema has had quite an eventful etymological journey, starting with new cinema with capital N and capital C from late 1960s to early 1970s, moving on to be called as parallel cinema post Ankur 1975, to be called as good cinema in 1980s, and then simply meaningful cinema in 1990s. It was majorly shaped by various positive negative discourses around it from 1960s to early 1990s. These discourses about what constitutes a good cinema framed how one understood the Indian new cinema. and what place it had in the Indian film industry. These discourses also reflect how alien or privileged the Indian new cinema was in the Indian film industry. Satyajit Ray imagined a good cinema to be more rooted in Indian life and in Indian ethos. I'm quoting him from his essay, very famous, very important essay that he wrote in 1948, titled "What is Wrong with Indian Films?" For the government of India, I'm quoting from the Film Inquiry Committee's report that came in 1950-51. A good film was something that promoted, and I'm quoting, national culture, education, and healthy entertainment, unquote. And for the government, it was also, a good film was also something that would not provide an escape into an unreal world. Film producers were suggested to make films which propagated ideas of freedom, justice, duty, or sacrifice for the welfare of the nation. In various speeches delivered by government officials, there was a constant emphasis on the word social, social industry, social mission, social task, social responsibility, and a need for reality effect, importance of story, etc. In their manifesto of the new cinema movement that was written in 1968, Arun Kaul and Mridal Sen envisioned good cinema to be something that, and I'm quoting them, involves methods and conditions of filmmaking, the relationship between the creative artist and his audience, awareness of the changing grammar, expanding powers, and soaring ambitions of the film medium, unquote. Then comes Ankur, and quite a bit changes as far as new Indian cinema or new wave in India is concerned. And its success brought a new nomenclature, parallel cinema, parallel to the Bombay film industry, but perhaps never meeting it. This possibly also indicated an end to pursuit of newness in the Indian cinema. At the 5th International Film Festival of India, 1975, a 2-day symposium was organized on parallel cinema. FFC's role was highlighted in starting parallel cinema in the way it encouraged emergence of young directors. Then the government comes up when the whole thing about amalgamation, merging FFC and NFDC was going on, and the government thought that the film industry needs sort of a restructuring. Of course, corporation needed a restructuring as well. It founds a working group discussing national film policy in 1980. Now, this report is very, very interesting for all of us to read. Those who are interested into cinema and the role of state in film industry in India, I will highly recommend that they read the National Film Policy Report that came in 1980. It's a beautiful document, giving us a lot of smiles at places and wondering what exactly we were thinking in 1980 about the film industry. Now, when it was describing a good cinema, or a quality cinema, it used words like progress, enlightenment, welfare of the country and its people, while talking about cultural quality of cinema. I mean, these are very vague terms which never gets defined in the clearest terms, but these are just thrown at us in some of these reports. When the Committee on Public Undertakings, a very important government document that came in 1982-83, when they desired to know the criterion of a good film, the Secretary of the Information and Broadcasting told, and I'm quoting them, it should have social relevance, try to show reality with the objective of reforming the society as far as possible, unquote. He cited Gandhi, Richard Attenborough's Gandhi, which was also co-produced by NFDC, as an example of a good film. The criteria of economic viability. Now, this is what makes everything funny and entertaining, the whole of 1980s and 1990s. The criteria of economic viability also got attached to a good cinema by early 1980s. By then, the new cinema movement had become healthy cinema movement and movement for better cinema. So we know that the newness had perhaps died down. The whole thing about parallel had also died down, and Indian film industry, or rather the government, actually was only searching for healthy entertainment or better cinema. As I earlier mentioned in part one, that how things started changing in the middle of 1970s, when FFC reports started talking about how the loans are not being repaid, and there is a lot of loss that is coming because of the way loans were provided, etc. By the early 1970s, the details of unpaid and bad debt started coming out. Someone called Madan Gaur wrote, and I really want to quote him in detail. He wrote, and I'm quoting him, barring, just look at the language he's using or the words that he's using to describe some of these filmmakers who are bringing, like, who are putting Indian cinema onto the world map, world cinema map, etc. Also earning a lot of, like, international awards for the country. Now, Mr. Gore writes, barring a few exceptions, Indian new wave films are nothing but a decoction of such drugs which act as slow poisons. The days are not far off when society will be completely engulfed by these dragons with tongues stretched out to poison the victim by their bite, unless he realizes in time the dangerousness of such reptiles and decides to keep away. The young, frustrated movie makers should better take up other jobs where their pedantry and hypocrisy may have scope, unquote. Mani Kaul and Kumar Shahani were particularly attacked for squandering a poor Indian's tax money and were advised, and I'm quoting, to migrate to Paris where they can get money and fame, unquote. This is again from 1975, and books are being written. Journals like Screen, which came from the Indian Express publication house, were, like, giving space to some of these opinions on Indian New Wave, on Indian New Cinema, and the two corporations. Many renowned filmmakers and producers also degraded the Indian New Cinema. Dev Anand, who was a very popular actor, and some of us, like, do enjoy him as well. He was talking in the context of Uski Roti, and he was quoted to have wondered, and I'm quoting him, how can you call it a motion picture? The picture doesn't move, unquote. Manoj Kumar, again a very popular actor of that time, he called the experimental filmmakers a frustrated lot who do not know what they are making and for whom they are making, and need the critics to interpret their work as though they are specially made wines. He's writing this in 1977. Vijay Anand, who was Dev Anand's brother, called the new cinema as a pale imitation of its Western counterpart. Words like parasite, self-fulfilling bastards were also used to describe some of these films and filmmakers. I want to, like, particularly talk about this face-off that happened between Mahesh Bhatt and Mrinal Sen. It's very interesting. Mahesh Bhatt called some of these directors as self-fulfilling bastards, and he particularly attacked Mrinal Sen, and he chose Amar Akbar Anthony over Kandahar. Mrinal Sen said that he would have felt uncomfortable and doubted his own creativity had he not proved boring to Mahesh Bhatt. So, as I said, quite a bit of masculinity was being used in these conversations between two separate industries, the conventional Bombay-based commercial filmmakers versus the new cinema filmmakers, which were portrayed as people wasting the hard-earned money of the common people. Another group of critics did not hesitate in branding new cinema as colonial and fascist in its tendencies. One such person was George Kutty, writing in the Screen and talking about how the whole elitism of the new Indian cinema reminds him of colonialism and the fascistic tendencies. Vimal Dissanayake came to the rescue of new cinema, and he countered George Kutty's point. He said, Vimal Dissanayake is a very famous film historian, and I'm quoting him. He said that new cinema, though influenced by the West, was not a very monolithic, simplistic surrender to the colonial consciousness, unquote. There were points of resistance and self-critique within the new cinema, and I will briefly talk about it in a short while. According to Dissanayake, it was unfair and unjust to ignore these points of resistance. He also pointed out how the new cinema created a ground where one could talk about, and I'm quoting him, traditions in terms of modernity, women's issues, political issues, and so on, unquote. New cinema was more complex than one assumed. And as Dissanayake had himself pointed out, there was an internal resistance, differences among the new cinema filmmakers. Many of them did not agree with each other what exactly good cinema is, or how to make a new cinema a new wave, how to make a good cinema at all. Filmmakers like Satyajit Ray did not approve of Kumar Shahani's cinema. Shahani, in turn, did not approve Shyam Benegal's films because he was an ad man who was financed by a private advertising agency. Mridal Sen and Basu Chatterjee celebrated realism in their film, but at the same time, Mani Kaul and Kumar Shahani were trained in anti-realism. Mani Kaul, Kumar Shahani, Mridal Sen, and others were on the same page when it comes to their views about FFC, that they believe that FFC should encourage more of experimentation without insisting on profit-making devices. Another group, with the most influential voice of Satyajit Ray siding with the second group, insisted that the corporation's responsibility was to develop a narrative. One second. To develop a narrative cinema with realism, authenticity, and ordinariness as primary virtue. Young filmmakers, for example, Ketan Mehta, Saeed Akhtar Mirza, Kundan Shah, who joined this movement in 1980s, also questioned the singular, homogeneous, and standard understanding of new cinema. They had their film language accommodate drama and incident as integral parts of their films. This is again post 1985. Some of these new filmmakers brought a new grammar, a new language to what we are calling as new cinema. Saeed Akhtar Mirza had also emphasized that the definition of serious cinema was changing, and it is better for the old guns of art cinema to modify their mode and attitude and adapt themselves to a changing scenario as far as our alternative film movement in India was concerned. Nasruddin Shah, his rebellion that continued from 1986 to early 1990s is something very interesting. I perhaps cannot, this could be a whole talk of an hour, maybe some other day, but just to give you a glimpse of what exactly he said, some of the things that he said in late 1980s, and he showed his disillusionment when some of these directors turned to Doordarshan and they were making Doordarshan projects. NFDC's money started coming less from NFDC, etc. So actors like Nasir went through different kind of crisis during this time. He was quoted to have said, and I'm quoting him, "You can't make a boring, brooding film and expect people to sit through it," unquote. In 1990, Shah expressed his anger and blasted, and I'm quoting him. I want to quote the entire paragraph. "Serious cinema was a big hoax from the start. These guys were making art films not because they believed in them, but because they were incapable of making masala entertainers for mass audiences. The moment Doordarshan provided them with an alternative, they ran thither and churned out rubbish like Nukkad and Manoranjan. The reason why serious cinema has died is because the people who are making serious Hindi cinema were a bunch of bloody fakes." So this is our own Nasruddin Shah talking about his disillusionment and branding an entire movement, a movement which made him the star of the alternative film movement, and how he was so disillusioned and so angry by the late 1980s and early 1990s. We know that he went on signing films like Jalwa, Mohra, etc. I mean, some of them are good entertainers for a different mood, etc. But this was very interesting for me to see the face off between Nasir and the people that are credited to make Nasir what he is today. Now, I mean, of course, these things are happening, but is it as innocent as it looks like? Should we question the interests of the parties that were involved in creating some of these discourses? My sense is that we must definitely investigate the interests of the parties involved in making these discourses, whether it is a common film lover talking about a particular film, using certain adjectives, etc. What is this how and why people come to just talk about it? Is it just an innocent disillusionment, or there is more self-interests involved in it? This answer more or less is yes. As early as 1971, Mani Kaul had warned about, and I'm quoting him, the vested interests falsely declaring the films unfeasible economically or trapping the films at distribution and exhibition stages in subtle ways, or at a more serious level by not acknowledging at all the presence of such a movement, unquote. Kumar Shahani had also addressed the issue of a created dichotomy between commercial and art cinema. The FFC's efforts dubbed as wastage of public money, and he wrote an essay to address some of these issues, which was published in Seminar, the December 1974 issue. Shahani alleged, and I want to quote him, I mean, one may disagree with the language that he is using, but we can also perhaps sense and maybe one can understand why Shani would use some of these words that he is using. And he's saying, one feeds the masses with opium and then one complains that art is inaccessible to them. One extracts the surplus value of labor and then divides it arbitrarily into public and private money. Radicals in this country seem to be concerned more about the taxpayers' money than about how he made his money in the first place. D.K. Karanjia also defended FFC and New Cinema from such attack, and he made a very forceful attack on this criticism based on a created category of films, that is new wave, which FFC or the government never used, first of all, for the films it supported and financed. And I want to quote what Karanjia wrote in the film fair. The myth of the Indian new wave has been perpetuated by certain interested parties, including some distinguished filmmakers. And the myth is sought to be demolished by the very people who perpetuated it in the first instance. This is a clever sleight of mind. Say that something is there, which isn't, and then go on to prove that it isn't. I want to briefly talk about discourses as such, and how discourse analysis should also be used when we are talking about quote unquote sensitive artistic movements, whether it is cinema or literature, etc., where a certain group of artists are dependent upon some sort of a patronage, and when we come across these kind of discourses which affects the interests of these artists, because we see that how in the late 1970s the whole demand for an NFDC came. The monetary support stopped coming from the government of India. The panorama, the whole attitude of Indian panorama, Indian National Film Awards was also changing. The way it looked at some of these films made under the new cinema rubric, maybe that could be another discussion for some other day. So one sees that these discourses, one-sided negative discourses, really had a real life ground level, impact on the way the corporation or the government had decided to support these films. That support had started gradually going out, was withdrawn. And we see that by 1990s, it totally vanishes for quite some time before NFDC reimagines itself as a facilitator in early 2000s. How exactly these discourses can help us in film history, in film studies? Such discourses give us a certain kind of knowledge about India's struggle to agree on what is good cinema. If new cinema was an idea, these discourses are most important to ascertain this idea. New cinema was a reality, no doubt, but its meaning can only be created by analyzing these discourses. Question of who is producing these meanings and what is their agency will also need to be taken into account. The pro-new cinema group celebrated it as an intellectual concept, as an idea, and placed it at the center of the formation of citizens in the newly independent India. They looked at it not only in aesthetic terms, but also as a serious socio-cultural practice. Various thoughts about the new/good cinema were determined by relations of power. While studying these discourses, it is important to examine the effects different discourses had, the political relations in which they took shape, and the positions held by those who used them, and also to explore these discourses on new cinema in their connections with various institutions manufacturing them or controlling the circulation of these discourses. These discourses about the new cinema and other cinema with capital O and capital C were certainly influenced by particular class interests. There is no doubt about it. Discourses produce knowledge that shapes perceptions and practice, as happened with the idea of new/good cinema. New cinema also functioned as a sort of ideology in the sense that it provided a set of criteria. Now, this is sort of a criticism of new cinema. It's also in the sense that if you read the kind of stuff that the new cinema filmmakers were talking as far as their attitude towards popular cinema is concerned, it sometimes is not very it's not in the very good spirit. So New cinema functioned as a sort of ideology which is quite stubborn sometimes, at times when you read some of those essays and interviews, in the sense that it provided a set of criteria of evaluation against which other cinemas were ranked and around which powerful positive and negative feelings clustered. It produced a certain kind of knowledge about cinema and certain attitude towards it. So it's like sometimes it comes across to be either you're with us or you're against us, something like that. I mean, that also happened with the attitude that the commercial Bombay-based film industry had towards new cinema filmmakers. So it seems it was quite a mutual feeling for each other. It produced a certain kind of knowledge about cinema and certain attitude towards it, a system of representation having the concepts of good cinema and bad cinema. It is valuable for us historians to study the development of discourses around good cinema so that we can learn how knowledge is produced and by whom and within what structures. So this is about discourses, and we have seen the importance, the significance of these. Now, I want to ask Ishan. Ishan, do you think I can take 10 minutes more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sure. So let's go to the third and final part. It's a short one, and let's see among all this chaos and everything, good things happening, bad things happening, people are abusing each other back and forth. Where exactly is the master, the Satyajit Ray himself? How is he making sense of this, something new that was happening in Indian film industry, in the cultural history of post-independent India? So let's briefly discuss that too, which again I think will amuse all of you, what exactly he was thinking and how some of his opinions had long-lasting, long-term impact on at least one filmmaker's career. Satyajit Ray had a very good relationship with the Film Finance Corporation and also with the NFDC. Satyajit Ray's early films like Charulata, Nayak, Gupiga, and Bagha Bain, they were all financed by the Film Finance Corporation. NFDC also came in towards the 1980s and produced some of his later films, for example, Ghare Baire, Ganashatru, and Ray's last film that came in 1992 called Agantuk was also produced by the NFDC. But then how did Ray react to the new cinema, which finally came in 1969 under FFC's patronage? A filmmaker who was so keen to see Indian ethos on Indian screen, was he all applaud for this kind of cinema? The answer is very complex. And I had a nice time when I was reading some of his essays and trying to make sense of what he was thinking about his contemporaries and how he looked at, how he interpreted the new Indian cinema. Of course, sometimes he boasts, he comes across as a snob filmmaker, but then that's Satyajit Ray, and you just have to if not agree with him, just you have to know what he's thinking. In late 19, or I think I'll skip this paragraph. I'll directly go to a very good essay that he wrote in 1971. And I'll also take you to the second essay that he wrote in 1980, talking about the Indian New Wave or Indian New Cinema. Both these documents are exquisite documents. They have conserved Ray's inimitable style of assessing his contemporaries, reflecting both a spontaneous disdain in 1971 and a thoughtful appreciation by 1980. He wrote a piece titled An Indian New Wave with a question mark in October 1971. Playing upon the word wave, he wrote, and I'm quoting him, "There is a belief gaining currency in film circle that a new wave of sorts is lapping on the shores of Indian cinema." Unquote. Wishing, quote, "all powers to those who are working to keep the wave from subsiding," unquote, he praised the FFC for, quote, for showing admirable courage and enterprise in providing loans to young, untested applicants as well as some old hands aspiring to make offbeat films, unquote. Against the background of significant global cinema movements, Ray located the Indian New Wave / cinema. The first question that he asks in this context is, and I'm quoting, how does one define offbeat in the context of Indian cinema, or more specifically of Hindi cinema, since much of the activity seems to be centered in Bombay, unquote. Then he posed his second question, and I'm quoting, isn't avant-garde in the European sense a viable proposition in India, unquote. Ruminating on the right kind of offbeat, he wrote almost condescendingly, they, referring to the filmmakers, talk of experiment without clearly specifying what lines the experiment is to take and how far it is to go. One only hears of low budget, of short shooting schedules, and of the avoidance of stars. One also hears occasionally of improvisation and of doing away with the story, unquote. He found some of these to be mutually annihilating concepts, with improvisation being the most dangerous and deluding concept. So he was definitely not in support of experimentation and improvisation, with which filmmakers like Manikal and Kumar Shani was trying to bring in under the help of Film Finance Corporation. While this 1971 essay is on its own is a very joyous read, whether one agrees or disagrees, it is the last two paragraphs that went on to be much highlighted by the press and the film critics. It has since been quoted to indicate a face-off between Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen. Summing up his views on the Indian New Wave, Ray brought in Bhuvan Shom in his concluding paragraph of the essay. His abrupt 7-word summary of Sen's feature film went on to become a much quoted and discussed extract. According to Ray, whatever success Bhuvan Shom achieved, and I'm quoting him, has not been because of, but in spite of its new aspects. It worked because it used some of the most popular conventions of cinema, which helped soften the edges of its occasional spiky syntax. These conventions are a delectable heroine, an ear-filling background score, and a simple, wholesome, wish-fulfilling screen story. In bracket, then Satyajit Ray writes, and that's what has become much quoted, summary in 7 words, big bad bureaucrat reformed by rustic ballet, unquote. He was also quick to add an optimistic note to it. Ray added, in Bhuvan Shom's success, there may be a pointer for the new filmmakers. Bhuvan Shom may well define the kind of offbeat film most likely to succeed with our minority audience. The kind that looks a bit like its French counterpart, but is essentially old-fashioned and Indian beneath its trendy habit. Let me take you to what he exactly thought of two of the most boldest, most controversial filmmakers Indian New Wave, Indian New Cinema has ever seen, and who were also the center point of attack in the 1970s, 1980s, in the discourses that I have just cited in the second part. I mean, it was very unfair on the part of the film critiques from both the sides to equate new cinema only with Manikal and Kumar Shani. That definitely, like, no, that sort of unfairness may be intentional, like, no, made new cinema and Film Finance Corporation pay a huge cost because of that misunderstanding, or maybe a planned sort of equation between new cinema and Manikal and Kumar Shani. What exactly Ray, how did Ray decipher, how did Ray understand Manikal and Kumar Shani? While Ray was very, very highly impressed, unconditionally impressed with MS Satyu's Garam Hava, he had mixed opinions as far as Duvidha, Manikal's Duvidha and Kumar Shani's Maya Darpan is concerned. What did he think of Duvidha? What did he think of Manikal? Satyajit Ray found Call to be a phenomenon to be reckoned with. Positive, everybody is happy, but then again, wait for it. And he put Duvidha on a par with some of the best of the Betala stories. However, his contempt for experiment had not softened yet. He went into the depth of Call's filmmaking and offered his critique. Now, this is very, very interesting. And I'm quoting him. Call's impatience with conventional narrative methods leads him to a visual style replete with cliches of another sort. The film revels in compositions which, before they have conveyed their meaning, have sounded their echoes of all that is chic in modern advertising photography. This is self-indulgence and as such incompatible with any sort of discipline. For me personally, the key words of this paragraph has to be cliches, modern advertising photography, self-indulgence, and incompatible. Perhaps that is how he understood money call. So not really a conditional, now not really an unconditional appreciation to money call kind of cinema. But he still did not dismiss completely. He did not cancel money call. That was reserved for Kumar Shani. When he watched Kumar Shani's Maya Darpan, Ray picked up on the characterization of the female protagonist. Her inward and wordless suffering manifested majorly only by a slow, rigid ambulation up and down verandas, repeated every 5 minutes or so throughout the film. Without mincing words, Ray proclaimed, and I want to quote him in detail. To me, Maya Darpan seems a combination of poor psychology and poorer stylization. Even the sophisticated response to color goes for nothing in a film that is so gauche in its handling of the human element. Even more than call, Shani seems to forget that when one imposes a rigid style on the actor without a thorough working out of its expressive possibilities, it becomes indistinguishable from bad acting. The only possible approach here is a psychological one, for which Shani seems to have no use. Ray's dismissal, unquote, Ray's dismissal of Shani's debut film cost Kumar Shani dearly in terms of availability of finances for his future ventures. Shani had to wait for more than a decade to arrange for finances for his next film, Tarang, which came only in 1984. And you'll be you'll be surprised to know that Maya Darpan, the film, does not even figure at all on the NFDC's website, which shows some of its films, but with, on some fees, etc. that you pay. Maya Darpan is nowhere to be found on NFDC's website. I don't know whether it is because of the whole history of the cancellation of Maya Darpan as a film, etc. But in the cinephile circle, Maya Darpan has now received quite a bit of cult status. So people who really understand cinema as an art, they do talk about Maya Darpan, and Maya Darpan is very well known for its usage of color, with whatever technological advancements, whatever was available in 1972. People now agree that Shani made the best use of that, and Maya Darpan is known for that. So we see that Satyajit Ray was not really very impressed with some of these filmmakers, especially with the experimenters and people who were talking about improvising with capital I, Indian film grammar, etc. Especially with Kumar Shani, he just could not understand Maya Darpan at all, and he didn't mince any words. He didn't think of the consequences, and he expressed himself very openly about it. Satyajit Ray finally gave legitimacy to New Indian cinema only in 1980, and he wrote an essay called "The New Cinema and I." And he praised the new films that was coming, especially from South India, especially from Karnataka, films like Samskara, Ghat Shraddha, etc. And he also praised Govind Denali's film Akrosh that came in 1980. And he praised these films, he liked them. And we know that most of these films follow a very narrative method of storytelling, something that Satyajit Ray himself has celebrated in almost all his films. So he bestows legitimacy, he agrees with these kind of filmmakings, he also appreciates the corporation once again. And he also goes on talking about how these filmmakers who are young with certain ideas as far as or vision when it comes to filmmaking must not forget about getting the investment back, and also must not forget about the prospective audience who is going to watch their films. So he gave these two kind of reminders to these young filmmakers who were making films in the 1970s and 80s. Let me conclude by saying, rounding up the arguments, the presentation that I just read. The purpose of the talk today was to inform ourselves that the history of the new cinema is not only about the FFC and NFDC. It is not new cinema itself as a film movement is not itself a homogeneous monolithic category. So its narrative is also not very monolithic. The story of new cinema, Indian new cinema, the story of the corporation also, both the corporations, FFC as well as NFDC, is not just about the state or the government. There are many more integral units, which we must talk when we talk about, when we want to understand, when we talk about the history of these three units. For example, governments, ministries, bureaucrats, financiers, producers, filmmakers, technicians, film critiques, cinephiles, common film viewers who are writing in film journals, Hindi as well as English. They all made unmade Indian new cinema, and that's where I think the best part that I enjoyed throughout my research was the whole discourse analysis that I was doing in my chapters. The new cinema movement was probably not a state project. That's one of my arguments in my PhD research. One cannot be sure which preceded whom, the filmmaker's desire for a new cinema or the state's desire for a new citizen. After all, Ray's 1948 essay that I briefly mentioned earlier appeared a year before the government constituted the Film Inquiry Committee, which was constituted in 1949. While it cannot be established with certainty that the new cinema movement was an indirect consequence of states' financing of the FFCE and NFDC, the new cinema movement certainly was not an accident. The filmmakers and the urban audience desired a change. FFC intervened as a financier and emerged as chief benefactor of India's new cinema. FFC, along with NFDC, remained chief patrons of the alternative cinema movement in India until the 1990s. The major achievements of the two corporations have been the support provided to the new cinema movement itself. The new cinema filmmakers were able to make the kind of cinema they made only because FFC existed. The FFC and the NFDC also succeeded in creating a niche audience and a niche private producers group who have, as I mentioned earlier briefly, who have kept up the desire for alternative cinema alive. The major failure, however, of the two corporations have been a total apathy and aversion to solve the problem of distribution and exhibition of their feature films, which is a major lacuna, and as I mentioned earlier, the new cinema filmmakers had to pay a huge price for the lack of distribution and exhibition facilities from NFDC and FFC. So thank you very much. I stop here and we can go back to, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sudha, for that wonderful lecture on, because I think I am very fortunate because of Carvan. I got to talk to some of these filmmakers about their art. We interviewed Adur, Girish, Kasarvalli, Shyam Benegal, and I had a great conversation off the record conversation with Kumar Shahani, because he's not ready to speak publicly now.
Okay. Yeah.
His views on cinema, and especially cinema of today, I think was very great. And the way you have narrated the whole story kind of makes for a great introduction to the whole movement that we witnessed from 1960s, 1990s. You mentioned Saeed Mirza. I think we also had Saeed, and his was one of the longest interviews that he did ever, 2-hour interview that he did for
he loves to talk.
Yeah.
He loves to talk. I met him in Bombay, regarding my regarding my PhD when I was trying to finalize one of these chapters. He loves to talk, but I think at that time he did not have much time.
Yeah.
I think he is the angry young man of new cinema. Yeah. Yes.
So, and we also are going to host Aparna Sen and Meera Nair, who also are part of the NFDC. Were part of the NFDC, but I think now we see this decline of influence of NFDC on cinema because of this private fundings and all, because the video that you should also mention only 3 upcoming projects of NFDC. There was a time when they used to do
Yes.
almost every film was financed by NFDC
Yes.
in the 60s.
Yes.
But I do not see any question on the YouTube chat.
Perfect.
But
If you have questions, or we can just have a conversation.
yeah, yeah,
Or maybe
yeah.
we can wait for a couple of minutes.
Sure,
Yeah.
we can. And that Nasir's comment, I think I have to ask Nasir Saab if he's going to be on Caravan someday. I'll definitely ask this question.
I think you had him earlier, right? And I think
Yeah.
Ratna and both of them came, right? I still have to watch that video, and I think now I should go back to it.
Yes.
And why not? Please ask him. Please probe him.
Yeah.
And all the best. If he shows his wrath again to you, all the best if you are at the receiving end. But I think he has softened maybe after the sad demise of Mrinal Sen.
Yeah.
Yeah. When Mrinal Sen passed away, I think somebody asked him because they had a face of. I think they worked on a movie called Genesis, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. So according to Nasir, that was the time when he was he really got disillusioned with the whole thing. I mean, he couldn't make sense of what Mrinal Sen was doing in Genesis. And there are reports that how Om Puri and Shabana Azmi would just look at these two arguing, fighting on the sets, etc., trying to talk about कि ये इसको ऐसे shoot करना है या ये क्या हो रहा है. So somebody asked him when Mrinal Sen passed away, and then he said कि yeah वो तो पुरानी बात हो गई, चलता है, we are like artists, etc. So I'm sure, but yeah. But I mean, it came to me as sort of a surprise. Yeah.
Because he was part of this, as you mentioned,
Yes.
Those are the films that made him
exactly
what he is.
Exactly.
And then you mentioned about the criticism of Satyajit Ray about this whole movement. I think it was Girish Kasarwalli who mentioned that, I do not make films for my audience. I make films for myself. I don't care if the audience is coming to watch my films or not.
Yes.
And there's the same criticism that Satyajit Ray had, that you must have this idea for audience as well. When you're making a film, you must have this in mind that audience is going to come see your film. They should connect with the film.
Yes.
The film should be able to just get the finances out of it.
Absolutely. But Isha, let me also tell you, and again, this is again there in the article that I got published recently. You may have seen it.
Yeah.
So by 1990s, this is again in the context of Agantuk. It seems Agantuk couldn't really get that kind of audience which Ray was expecting. So in an interview which he gives to some foreign channel, he shows his displeasure. He uses the word that Indian audience is fairly backward. This is the 1991-92 Ray, who does not receive the same kind of reception, audience for his last film. So he says that, but again, as I want to still think it in the most optimistic way, that he kept on thinking, putting his audience in front of his eyes before making a film. Yeah, but then I want to be sympathetic, and there is a whole discussion also which is there in my in my research as well. This whole thing of audience problem. So according to Mani Kaul and Kumar Shani, the audience problem was a created, manufactured problem. Mani Kaul kept saying that I don't have much of an audience problem. I have the distribution and exhibition problem.
Yeah.
The film is not reaching the audience that it is being made for. Even the niche audience had to wait for a film festival, etc., to watch these films.
Yeah.
And there are evidences where 27 Down, it seems, ran for 13 weeks in a Bombay cinema in 1971-72 when it was released. Today, you and me, some of my friends cannot understand 27 Down. But I was surprised to know, okay, in 1971-72, at least there was some group of people, some audience which was watching it for 13 weeks.
Yeah.
It was only one show, but 13 weeks running, for a film like 27 Down. So the evidences that I have come across, the kind of conversation that I have come across, I think I tend to agree with these filmmakers that it's more of a distribution exhibition problem rather than an audience problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, these were artists, and I really want to stand with them. Like, sometimes they may come across as elite in their opinions, or they come across as snobs, but that's who they were. Recording their times. I mean, I can't imagine Kumar Shani taking a tape of his own film and going out in film bazaar and trying to.
No.
I can't. And I'm not demeaning the job, etc. Of course, many people do it. But then there are some artists who are like that, perhaps who need support, and maybe NFDC should have been more aggressive as far as distribution and exhibition is concerned. Because of the lack of will on that part, people like Kumar and Manikal had to pay.
Yeah.
By being called an elitist filmmakers. There was a time when even Satyajit Ray was regarded as something who was insignificant to Indian film industry, because वो तो सिर्फ international audience के लिए फिल्में बनाते हैं. So it's not just Kaul or Shani, but people like Ray has also been at the receiving end of much of these criticism.
Adur once, I think, in our interview only, he joked that films that are commercially hit are called the commercial cinema, and those which flop on a screen are termed as art cinema for an audience.
Yes.
Film that you can't understand is art cinema, and film that do well in cinema is good cinema.
Yes. So many of the researchers these days are also trying to come out of these categories, also these binaries. Can we understand cinema as cinema, and can we straight talk about distribution problems or audience problems, etc., whatever it is called? How can we hook onto that niche audience which Mrinal Sen was also talking about? I mean, many of these filmmakers are not desiring a box office success. Their main desire was, okay, the film should be made, and whatever niche audience is available, whatever small audience is available, it should reach at least to them. They should not wait on for 2-3 years for a film festival to come up where they would go and watch it. So, and I think NFDC failed on that account. I mean, you'll be surprised, perhaps you already know that Kamal Swaroop's Om Dar Badar got a release only after 25 years in the year 2014. Before that, it was only part of film festivals, film clubs, societies, etc. So, and thanks to PVR's director, Special, they used to have some of these things in that time. So it got released, and I think it was the restored version. So, yeah.
And we also have Kamal Swaroop coming on Karwan on 20th July. 20th of this month, we have Kamal Swaroop on Karwan. There's also a question that comes to my mind, is because Girish Kasarwali mentioned it in the interview, that when he was making Mane Ghar with Nasir and Deepthi Nawal, the main concern of the NFDC was because he wanted a big budget from NFDC, but the NFDC said, we can't give you big budget for a regional film.
Yes.
So you have to make it bilingual.
Yes.
So do you think NFDC was kind of limited in its scope and kind of focused only on Hindi cinema?
Yes. That's a very valid complaint, Ishana. There is enough evidence to support that that I won't call it anti-regionalism, but clearly it comes out if you look at the history of FFC also from 1960s onwards. Bombay-based filmmakers have got maximum support, in that sense, and regional film producers, filmmakers have also have expressed their displeasure with both the corporations. In fact, you will be surprised to know, if you don't already know, that John Abraham, the Malayali filmmaker, very famous Malayali filmmaker, he made a film called as Donkey in a Brahmin Village. The Malayali, I think the film was made in Tamil. The Tamil title is Agraharathil Kadutai. He had applied to FFC for a loan, and FFC, of course, accepted the application, etc. He sent a portion of the film was also shot, and he sent the whole tape of that portion was shot to the Film Fund Corporation. After much wait and a whole ordeal, etc., FFC denied the loan application because they did not like the title of the film. donkey in a Brahmin village, they found it that it may hurt the sentiments. So those things have also happened, and there was like reports of corruption as well as in NFDC, you know. So yeah, there is a strong evidence to believe that regional filmmakers could have been supported far better by the FFC and NFDC, and I think Hindi filmmakers always had an edge with the FFC and NFDC.
Yes, so in a way they kind of couldn't
Yes.
justify their objective of
Yes.
promoting good
Yes,
cinema.
yes. Yeah. So this whole thing about like bringing an improvement in Indian film industry
Yeah.
somehow didn't really, and I think in that sense maybe I mean, of course, like because of nostalgia, etc., we might miss NFDC being very active in the production market these days. But it's only good that the private agencies like took their lessons from the FFC NFDC history and they entered the market. So today you can see Karan Johar or Kiran Rao supporting a film like Ship of Theseus by Anand Gandhi, which was not possible in the 70s and 80s. So it's not really a loss with the private money coming up and backing directors like these. It's not a bad thing if you think it from that angle. And I think I would definitely give credit to FFC and NFDC also, that they created that market, and which was again appropriated by the private agencies post global economic reforms. Yeah, a market which NFDC itself was not aware of. But the private agencies, like the private distributors, became very aware because Government of India started supporting it. Banking industry, became very active. Money started pouring in. Black money went away, So film industry was declared as an official industry in 1998-97. Yeah. Okay, so and the private capital really capitalized on that niche audience, which FFC and NFDC could not. So today you and me can go and watch Ship of Theseus or Masan or Aankhon Dekhi, some of these films which comes out of Film Bazaar, NFDC's Film Bazaar. And we can also, I mean, it's not really surprising. I mean, it may be surprising, but we see Kiran Rao, Karan Johar supporting some of these filmmakers, and they are earning money also out of it. Yeah. Yeah. Lipstick Under My Burqa is also, I think, did go through Film Bazaar, one of these sections that they have.
And then you mentioned Karan Johar, he also kind of supported this regional film called Sairat, and then
yes, exactly.
I think he also supported Bahubali, but Bahubali
is a very mainstream film.
Yeah, it was a big budget film.
Yes.
But,
so by mid-1990s, I think the private capital started noticing that okay, there is a niche audience for these kind of films, and we must appropriate it for our own profit, which became profitable for them. Yeah. I mean, many of these films, I mean, Lunchbox got released. I mean, I can't see. So the story from Uski Roti to Lunchbox, if you see, I mean, these two are very different, but there is a connection. Lunchbox could get released. It won awards, it saw the theatrical release, etc. It has been quite a journey for the new cinema and independent cinema also. Yeah. So I won't criticize completely the intrusion, if I can use, I mean, if one wants to use that word, of the private capital into encashing the niche audience available for this kind of cinema.
There is a question for you by Amrit Amlan Patnaik. His question is, how would you see the circulation of NIC films beyond the attempts of NFDC, especially in small towns, to reach out with an intent to find or discover a discerning audience there?
How will I?
How would you see the circulation of NIC films beyond the attempts of NFDC, especially in small towns, to reach out with an intent to find or discover a discerning audience there?
Small towns, yeah. Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, I want to give a long answer to it. Okay, so first point that one needs to remember is NFDC did in fact try to take some of these films in small towns as well. For example, they had, along with UGC, they had something called as college film clubs, etc. And these colleges were not just like, these colleges which were like, targeted were not only in the tier 1 cities, but they were also in the small towns as well. But I mean, I don't have evidences because my research did not look at that, but I came across this information that with UGC, they had a university film club where they used to send these films, okay, their own films. Second thing is, there is some film scholars have talked about a film club, a film society in a village somewhere near Bangalore. This film society was called Nina Samaj. Okay, so this was sort of an NGO which used to work with peasants, farmers in this small village close to Bangalore. This is the story I'm telling you from 1970s. Now, the success story of this film society is very, very inspiring in the sense that this breaks that myth, that these films cannot be understood by uneducated, non-anglicized population. So these are farmers we're talking about, who don't even own the land, they're tillers, okay? This NGO, which works with them, every week, they show films like Pathir Panchali to them. Okay, and of course, I mean, somebody will say that Pathir Panchali is all about poverty, so they will understand it. But there were other films also which were shown to them about Brahmanism, or other new cinema filmmakers coming from South and North as well. And there are reports, it's there in my research also, and the villagers were recorded to be crying at crucial scenes without understanding the language. They can't even read the subtitles sometimes if it is not in their language, okay? But the sentiment was reaching to them. All right, so it's all black and white films. There is a notion that the poor people, etc., always go to the popular, entertaining films. But here are peasants who are reacting very positively to some of the most difficult films which are being watched by anglicized urban audience in film festivals. So do look up for the story of Nina Samaj. I'm sure Google will throw something. And if possible, maybe I can reply on the YouTube to this gentleman's question. Okay. Third incident that I want to recollect here and share is, again, this is not the NFDC effort, but I think somebody must have asked Shyam Benegal about this whole question of being an elite filmmaker. Okay, so he tells that when Ankur was released, after quite some time, he received a letter from a woman who writes in the letter that she's making somebody else write this letter on her behalf. And he uses the word Harijan. Today we call them as Dalits. So she is a Harijan lady, okay? And she's writing this in this letter that I happen to watch your film Ankur, and it is so close to our life. It made me cry, etc. So he uses this incidents as a myth breaker. That if the films reach these audience, let these films reach the audience. And let them decide what they want to watch. Okay, so it's like these films have reached the common, again, these could be exceptions. These are handful of incidences. But then again, they show that, yeah, there may be cases where these films must have reached small towns, etc. Okay, but then the effort must come from people like you and me, University Circle, NFDC itself must talk about, because the whole concept of Janta theaters, which only remained in proposal, was the whole focus of Janta theaters was tier 2, tier 3 cities in India, or the small semi-urban, semi-rural places, which never kicked off because the nation had different priorities, funding, lack of funding, etc. The whole post-75 politics changed, the gear changed, etc. So I don't know if I've answered this question, but these are some of the things that comes to my mind when it comes to small town receiving these films. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sudha, for answering the question, for this conversation.
Yeah.
I think we can talk endlessly about cinema, and
Yes.
there's still scope for more conversations.
Yes.
But I look forward to hosting you again. And I hope your monograph would be out very soon that we can read.
Crossing my fingers. Yes. Yeah. Sure.
And I think it would be great. So those who are watching us, please do share this video with your friends and do like the video if you want. And if you have any question after you watch the video later, you can put that in the comments, or you can email that to us on carvanheritage@gmail.com. We'll forward the email to Sudha. She can get back to you through emails. And I think this was one of the best lectures that I hosted on cinema. One of the most interesting, because uh, I think जो इस समय मुझे भूत सवार है वो 1970s का है. So I think that's the reason. But thank you so much, Sudha. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in.
Thank you very much, Ishan, for this like longer conversation. I think this is one of the, or maybe the only long conversation I have had on my work, like on a platform like this. So I'm much grateful, much honored, and I mean I can't express my thanks enough to you. So thank you very much, and all the very best for your other talks. And I'll perhaps be more keen follower of some of your talks upcoming, because I would really love to listen to Mirza and other filmmakers that you're planning to invite. So
Thank
all
you
the
so
very
much.
best. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you
you so
everyone,
much,
to all
Sudha.
the audience who have watched this talk today. Yeah.
And those who are watching us, our next conversation is scheduled on 16th of July, which is on partition and impact of partition on food. We have four wonderful speakers. We have Mariam Jilani, she's a chef and writer of a Pakistani descent, lives in Philippines. We have Professor Pushpesh Pant from India and Chef Ranveer Barar from India. And to talk about the food of undivided Bengal, we have Preetha Sen, one of the most respected food critics and writers, writing on the Bengali food. So thank you so much. Do join us for that partition conversation. Tomorrow I'll be interviewing Shama Zedi, that you'll be listening maybe on 20th or whenever we plan to publish that. But before that, you'll watch. We have just released the trailer for Apurva Asrani's conversation. Apurva Asrani, as you know, is the editor of films like Satya, maker of many great. He is the writer of Aligarh, the most important film I think of our times. So do watch that. Do listen to that conversation. Thank you so much, and we'll meet again.
Thank you, Ishan.
Thank you.